My name is Mickey Snowden, and I'm graduating from the MLAS program with a Cultural and Environmental Sustainability Certificate. My key area of focus throughout the program has been communicating climate change and its impacts on marginalized populations. The topic of my thesis, how climate change will disproportionately impact socially vulnerable communities in the Southeastern U.S., is directly in line with my passion in education. The touchstones of my research were Robert Bullard and his work in environmental justice, Susan L. Cutter and her pioneering work on integrating social vulnerability and natural disasters, Flanagan et al.'s article, Social Vulnerability Index for Disaster Management, and the IPCC's climate reports. I conducted personal interviews for this project with 5 subject experts in the state, which largely enriched my dataset and findings. I hope you enjoy my thesis presentation. The effects of climate change can be seen virtually everywhere, from increasingly catastrophic hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean to a doubling of forest fires in the western U.S. within the last 35 years. Climate change is not a new concept. Thanks to ice core samples, we know that Earth's carbon dioxide levels have fluctuated between about 180 and 300 parts per million. But since 800,000 BCE, carbon dioxide levels have never exceeded 300 ppm circa 1950. As of September 2019, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported nearly 415 ppm of carbon dioxide in our Earth's atmosphere. The International Panel on Climate Change warns that a warming of 2 degrees Celsius versus a warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the agreed-upon benchmark set by the United Nations 2016 Paris Agreement, could significantly increase global mean temperatures while also increasing precipitation in some regions and causing droughts in others. The potential damage this kind of climatic change could have on food and water resources across the world is of paramount concern. Although the U.S. accounts for 40% of the world's carbon emissions, the country does not have a strong stance on climate change. In lieu of a national climate plan, climate adaptation and resilience plans in the U.S. have been produced at the city level, but these plans have traditionally focused on cities' physical assets, which tend to be tied to wealthier residents, leaving socially vulnerable populations out of the planning process. Climate change poses significant and distinct threats to the southeastern U.S. The Environmental Protection Agency reports that average annual temperatures have increased in the region by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. The 2 most severe threats to the region, extreme heat and rising sea levels, are intrinsically linked to one another in that hotter temperatures result in expanding oceans and increased flooding from more frequent and severe storm systems. Coastal regions, such as Charleston and Miami, are some of the most at-risk areas to climate-induced hazards, such as sea level rise, flooding, droughts, stronger hurricanes, and vector-borne diseases because of their proximity to the coast, their higher temperatures, and their large populations. Although it seems counterintuitive, migration to coastal cities in the Southeast has been increasing rapidly. One of the difficulties in understanding climate change is that its effects are often ambiguous. Hotter temperatures, rising sea levels, and stronger storms are only some of the associated hazards. Both flooding and drought affect crop yields, especially the compounding effects of the two together. Drought followed by flooding can decimate crops and thus negatively affect the livelihood of farmers and farm workers across the Southeast. This process can also cause topsoil, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers to run off into nearby rivers and streams, harming local ecosystems. The greatest threats that climate change poses to the Southeast are extreme heat, flooding, and more frequent and severe storms, and drought. According to the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, extreme heat in the U.S. is, quote, deadlier than all other natural disasters combined, end quote, and will worsen due to climate change. Heat also negatively affects air quality, exacerbating respiratory illnesses such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and aggravating allergies. Rapid development in the Southeast is increasing carbon dioxide levels, which exacerbate the growth of allergenic plants like ragweed. The Southeast as a whole is a socially diverse region. Approximately 55% of the U.S. African American population lives in the Southeast, and roughly 20% of these residents live below the poverty line. These socioeconomic factors contribute to a population's social vulnerability, a concept popularized by a researcher and professor Susan L. Cutter in the 1990s. Cutter defined social vulnerability as, quote, a measure of both the sensitivity of a population to natural hazards and its ability to respond to and recover from the impacts of hazards, end quote. Much like climate change, social vulnerability has traditionally been viewed as an existential issue that has been hard to define and therefore hard to mitigate. An individual's ability to adapt to the effects of climate change, also known as one's adaptive capacity, is not the same for everyone. Adaptive capacity is affected by social determinants of health, such as race, gender, age, income, health status, and education. Climate change will disproportionately impact socially vulnerable populations in the coming decades, and climate adaptation planning must prioritize these communities. Climate change poses serious risks to an often overlooked population, incarcerated people. Over 2 million individuals in the U.S. are in prison or jails, completely dependent on county, state, or federal governments for their well-being. Climate-induced hazards pose multiple risks to incarcerated people, including flooding, as experienced during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and wildfires, as experienced in Colorado and California. In both the Colorado and California wildfires, prisoners were evacuated. However, during Hurricane Katrina, Orleans Parish Prison and the New Orleans City Jail were not evacuated, and prisoners were left without food, water, or power in sewage-contaminated floodwaters for days. Unhoused populations are exceptionally at risk to the effects of climate change because they lack shelter and are constantly exposed to all environmental elements. These populations typically have a multitude of factors that contribute to their overall social vulnerability, including drug and/or alcohol abuse, poverty, mental health issues, and medical issues. Therefore, their adaptive capacity is already at a dangerously low level. Unhoused populations are extremely reliant on public services, which are often affected during a climate-induced hazard. Inland areas outside of coastal plains face their own climate hazards, such as extreme heat, flooding, and landslides. In rural areas, farm workers are especially at risk to extreme heat, particularly migrant farm workers. Climate change is and will continue to impact crop yields, which will likely further degrade the livelihood of farmers and exacerbate their financial, social, and health stresses. An estimated 1/2 billion labor hours are projected to be lost to extreme heat by the end of the century. Heat tends to concentrate in urban areas, a process known as the urban heat island effect. Concrete and pavement absorb heat, and greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, buildings, and industry create heat that becomes trapped in the densely built urban environment. While trees and green spaces cool urban areas because plants and trees absorb little heat and sequester carbon dioxide, many inner-city neighborhoods lack these natural resources, making them heat islands. In their presentation, Tree Cover and Urban Heat Islands in Asheville, a group of researchers explained how the urban heat island effect has increased in certain parts of Asheville since 1984. The team combined information on tree cover, land surface temperatures, and neighborhood-specific socioeconomic data from U.S. Census block data to create a series of maps highlighting the correlation between the urban heat island effect and social vulnerability in certain areas of the city. Looking at a map of redlining, the process in which banks refused to lend African Americans adequate home loans in the early 20th century, it's clear that to some degree, tree canopy loss, land surface temperature, and social vulnerability are all interconnected. Due largely to irresponsible city planning, the River Arts District and South Slope regions of Asheville possess the greatest overall vulnerability in this study, regions that were once redlined by the city and underwent urban renewal in the mid to late 20th century. African American neighborhoods were significantly impacted by Hurricane Katrina in 2005, despite New Orleans having been a majority black city before the hurricane, 67% of the city's population in 2000. This was largely due to communities like the Lower Ninth Ward, which was 96% African American before the storm, that were built in low-lying, flood-prone areas situated below sea level, and that were negatively affected by unjust land use policies that benefited wealthier and whiter communities. Higher socioeconomic populations have higher concentrations of wealth, stable jobs that tend to have more flexibility, and resources, such as personal vehicles, second homes, and good insurance. Therefore, they have a higher adaptive capacity than lower socioeconomic populations. There has been criticism from the white community as to why poor blacks did not evacuate New Orleans before Katrina hit, given that they were cautioned to do so a full day before the hurricane made landfall. However, this argument is unsubstantiated and uninformed. In many cases, socially vulnerable populations in neighborhoods affected by Katrina lacked access to personal vehicles and adequate financial resources needed to travel, had jobs they depended on, and didn't want to leave their families, homes, and possessions out of fear of separation, damage, and looting. While a wealthier white household may be able to leave their home and possessions during a disaster, knowing they have the ability to repair, rebuild, or even restart after the disaster, a poorer, non-white household does not have the same luxury. This can be difficult to understand for those with higher adaptive capacities. After a large-scale natural disaster, high-income neighborhoods grow and improve, while low-income neighborhoods undergo one of two critical changes: neighborhood gentrification disguised as revitalization, or neighborhood decline. High-income neighborhoods are more likely to receive substantial financial assistance from the federal government and large payouts from insurance claims, whereas low-income neighborhoods are not likely to benefit from this type of assistance. After Katrina, instead of attempting to bring destroyed neighborhoods back to their pre-storm state, which would have included rebuilding or conserving public housing, the city approved the demolition of the majority of its public housing, even though only a small portion was severely damaged. Many neighborhoods were slated to be redeveloped into green neighborhoods rather than be restored. Louisiana legislator Richard H. Baker was even quoted in the Wall Street Journal as having made the comment, "We finally cleaned up public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did," end quote. While Baker's comment was insensitive, it echoed the thoughts of many of the city's planners and developers. In the wake of Katrina, the main barriers to neighborhood gentrification, concentrated poverty and high percentage of African American residents, were literally wiped out, leaving behind, for developers, terra nova. Jennifer Brennan of the Southern Environmental Law Center works on floodplain policy at the state level in Charleston. Brennan says the SCLC works to ensure that floodplain buyout programs are not just benefiting high-income areas as they have traditionally done. She explains that when looking at voluntary floodplain buyouts, the Federal Emergency Management Agency typically directs a significant portion of its grant funding towards communities with higher income and higher populations because the cost-benefit analysis is skewed to protect those with a large numeric value. In turn, local governments direct those funds towards areas of high social vulnerability within their communities, which creates inequity in the buyout implementation and changes the social fabric of a neighborhood. These are things that the SELC is working to fix by assisting low-income residents with the 25% match FEMA requires so that it is not just the wealthy neighborhoods who can afford to pay the match up front and relocate. Brennan says that this will help relocate entire communities rather than creating a situation where only the most socially vulnerable residents are being displaced from their community. The SCLC is also working to ensure that vulnerable populations are not just being moved from one part of a floodplain to another, as this is both damaging for residents and expensive for communities. Brennan's program is also encouraging the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to consider low-income communities in coastal defense projects by protecting natural lands around these communities to create green buffers from storms and flooding and to better manage stormwater. Fernleaf Interactive is a private company based out of Asheville focused on building climate resilience through combining GIS and social vulnerability mapping via climate models, the SVI, and census-level data. Fernleaf collaborates with UNCA's National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center to create a private-public partnership which maps both social and physical vulnerability to climate threats. Fernleaf and NEMAC have worked with policymakers and planners in communities across the Southeast, such as the Research Triangle region, Charleston, and West Palm Beach. Matt Hutchins, implementation lead at Fernleaf, says that his company begins a project by performing a quantitative assessment, essentially taking stock of a city's physical assets. From there, the company explains to local policymakers how their community's physical assets, such as hospitals, community centers, buses, fire departments, etc., are intertwined with the services that these assets provide the public. Hutchins says he believes that overall, communities are beginning to prioritize their most socially vulnerable populations. He cites the trend that many cities now have equity officers who take a systematic approach to examining social vulnerability, racial equity, and other factors that previously have not been considered in climate adaptation. Hutchins says he thinks groups are mostly interested in prioritizing socially vulnerable populations, but policymakers need the information to support these populations in the planning process, such as physical, social, and health risks, along with associated financial costs. According to Hutchins, climate change is the catalyst for starting conversations around larger systemic social issues that are indirectly related to climate change, but nonetheless important. Hutchins says that as communities are understanding how existing social issues are tied to changes in climate, equity officers and sustainability managers who take a cross-department perspective are more frequently part of adaptation planning workshops that help grow their understanding of the connection between climate and social vulnerability, which can then be translated into policy. Unfortunately, the barriers to implementing these necessary changes are many and difficult. Lack of education in the Southeastern U.S. may lower residents' risk perception of climate change, either because they do not understand how it is caused, what its effects are, or how to solve it, or a combination of all of the above. Impoverished communities bear the brunt of the effects of climate change, but they may not have the means to do anything about it. Poorer residents may lack the time to educate themselves on climate change or its risks, especially considering that climate change is a highly abstract concept. An individual working multiple jobs and still living below the poverty line is less likely to have the capacity to care about climate change, whereas wealthier, educated populations may be more aware of the climate issue, but have the luxury of being protected from its effects or externalizing the causes of climate change to marginalized communities via their elevated waste and emissions rates, which can be attributed to higher energy, food, and material consumption. Another reason marginalized communities may have a difficult time addressing climate change is due to their lack of political clout. As previously stated, city-level climate planning has largely left these residents out of important conversations or invited them to be stakeholders in a project only when the group in power has deemed it beneficial. As this presentation has shown with floodplain buyouts, green infrastructure, and rebuilding efforts after major climate hazards throughout the Southeast, many cities' climate plans have succeeded in further marginalizing their most vulnerable residents. This is not only inequitable, but it's dehumanizing. It is privilege in its purest form, both racially and socioeconomically. The wealthy not only keep themselves safe from the worst effects of climate change, but they consider the most impacted and vulnerable communities at their discretion. Social inequalities both create social vulnerability and exacerbate pre-existing vulnerabilities during climatic events, since existing inequalities tend to persist throughout climate planning, response, and recovery phases. This is why it is imperative that policymakers prioritize their community's most socially vulnerable populations. Prioritizing populations that have been historically marginalized and left out of conversations regarding their future welfare has the potential to not only reduce strain on government systems, but to also rebuild power structures that have consistently created and perpetuated social vulnerabilities. Actively including as many stakeholders from as many backgrounds and perspectives as possible into climate planning on all scales will ensure that the Southeast adapts to climate change equitably. Rather than the white and the wealthy surviving and thriving over other races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic backgrounds as they have traditionally done, climate change can unite our country in an unprecedented ways around the common goal of reversing the environmental damage we have done to our planet, adapting to the inevitable changes we have already put in motion, and building collective resilience to guarantee that equity and inclusion persist in the face of all future crises.